Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our research roundtable online. On behalf of the Department of Communication, University of Hyderabad, I welcome you. We are holding the meeting here on Zoom and livecasting it on Facebook. Pranay will just share the link in chat. If you fall off the meeting here or want to share this talk with someone else, please use that link. We would like to ensure that all the interactions in this forum take place in a cordial, collegial, and harassment-free environment. This means that the space is welcoming and respectful to all interested participants, regardless of identity, location, and background. We expect you to follow the rules of engagement. That is, check your username and change it to your name if needed. Turn off your microphones and videos for a smooth meeting with minimum lag. Raise your hand or post your questions in the chat section and wait for the moderator's instructions. Harassment of any kind and in any form, either verbal or non-verbal, in the chat or in questions and responses will not be tolerated, including deliberate intimidation or disruption during or after the talk. Those who do not comply with normal standards of decency and respect may have their account disabled and their participation in the current and future forums blocked. If you notice anyone engaging in potentially disruptive or disrespectful behavior, please inform the administrator. His email ID is pranay@uohyd.ac.in. The meeting is structured as follows: introducing the speaker, presentation by the speaker, short discussion inviting questions from the participants, live Q&A, open for all, moderated by host, wrap up and closing. Please remember to note your questions as the speaker is presenting. Raise your hand when questions are invited and wait for the moderator's instructions for your turn to ask. Kindly turn your microphone and or video when it is your turn to ask. Or you could also post your name, affiliation, and question in the chat if you would like the moderator to ask on your behalf. Today, we have with us Professor Usha Raman, and she will be speaking on deconstructing the data gaze. She is a professor in the department and teaches writing, science and health communication, and digital culture. She presented at the 69th International Communication Association Conference last year on the same theme and developed this work further during her Zenke Visiting Research Fellowship at the Center for Media, Communication and Information Research, University of Bremen in December 2019. Her paper, Keeping the Person in the Data, Communicating Care in the Networked Clinic, is now available as part of the Center's working paper series, Communicative Figurations. You can download it from the link in the chat I'll be posting shortly. Also find the link to her ICA presentation available on YouTube. Hello, Professor Raman. Welcome. Over to you, please.
Yes, thank you, Devina, and thanks everybody for being here. I see that there are about 34 participants on Zoom, and hello to those on Facebook as well. It's a little strange talking to a screen, but I'll try and make it as interactive as I can. So as Devina said, my talk is titled Deconstructing the Data Gaze. And it's something I've been thinking about for the past couple of years and following through with some field work. It's very much a work in progress. So some of the concepts that I will be talking about are a bit messy, and I beg your indulgence there. And I really welcome any inputs that you all might have. So to start, I'd like you to think about the many ways in which we think of ourselves. Many ways, but let's think of some descriptors: height, weight, cholesterol levels, age, resting heart rate, glycosylated hemoglobin, number of steps walked per day, compared to the number of steps walked yesterday or last month, number of likes on Instagram, number of engagements on your tweet. So you get the picture. If your phone or your fitness tracker says you've moved enough, you rest easy. If your social media feeds suggest popularity, you feel validated. If your latest laboratory reports suggest deviations from the normal, whatever the normal is, even if you feel fine, you begin to worry. But if you know how data works, and if you have a sense of how to read not only the numbers, but how it measures against how you feel, then you're able to use a variety of inputs to make judgments and decisions about your life. So I have this quote up on the slide: data are the starting point for what we know, who we are, and how we communicate. And this is from a very influential editorial in Big Data and Society by Lisa Gittelman and Virginia Jackson. And it's sort of the starting point for how I look at data as well. Last week, writing in The Hindu, the poet and literary critic Rukmini Bhaya Nair noted, a post-pandemic situation, like a post-truth one, will depend on sophisticated skills that can separate fake data from real and derive qualitative empathy from quantitative graphs. And I think that's really an important way to think about how data has begun to pretty much overtake our lives. So while data has begun to govern and mediate our lives in multiple ways across multiple spheres, my focus in this talk will base itself mostly on how data becomes an important and even dominant layer in the healthcare sector. Increasingly, patient data, drawn from a variety of sources and integrated both temporally and spatially, becomes an important and, of course, very useful mediator between the clinician and the patient. It comes from tests, from clinical trials, from the aggregated wisdom of systematic analyses, from wearables, our Fitbits, from the hospital's own records and individual interactions with the system. Looking at their computer screens, physicians can put together a biological profile of an individual from hundreds of abstracted sources of information. They then layer it with socioeconomic data from the individual's life, drawn from insurance and other databases. So just as our online activity allows corporations to profile our consuming selves, arguably our journey through medical and governance systems allows the creation of a psychobiological profile. In recent years, one strand of research in critical data studies has focused on the process and product of datafication. Taking a cue from Lisa Gittelman and Virginia Jackson's work that I mentioned earlier, that raw data, and I'm quoting here, raw data is an oxymoron. Using such concepts as data journeys and data frictions, this approach seeks to understand the contextual and contingent nature of data production and the various transformations it undergoes as it travels from one point to another in the information and meaning-making chain. Like other representational forms, data too travels through interpretive prisms as it goes from one field to another, encountering political, cultural, and ethical practices that reconstitute it and contribute to its further development through space and time. The attention in critical data studies then is on the life of data as they move through space and time, and I'm quoting Bates, Liu, and Goodale here, through different sites and cultures of data practice on their journey through the information production chain. Some scholars call for a situated, reflexive, and contextually nuanced epistemology that can challenge the dominance of data-driven methods. So if we have to think about where data comes from, it comes from a lot of different sources. It comes from the way we move, where we move, both online and offline. When we're carrying our mobile phones, of course, every moment, and if our GPS is on, our location is on, it tracks where we are, where we go, who we meet perhaps, and so on. So my own interest is to trace these data journeys in the field of healthcare from points of origin, that is the embodied self, through practices of representation and interpretation, and ultimately their presence and application in the clinic. I'm also interested in understanding the ways in which meanings are negotiated in these datafied spaces, whether and how they generate what David Beer calls the data gaze. And that's where I borrow the term from. And he raises the point that this gaze does moderate and, in fact, even construct the way we look at the world. So my interest is in how the data gaze moderates the embodied clinical interaction between individuals and their caregivers. So, we know that data does more than simply inform practice. It does augment knowledge, but it often stands in for the physical and material being. It constitutes reality sometimes. It represents us, it constructs us, and definitely it mediates between who we are and how the world sees us. So the few images that I have on this screen, if you remember Duti Chand and the whole controversy around gender, so if testosterone levels say something, no matter what you are and what you feel, doesn't seem to matter. So in that sense, data and medical data do seem to constitute us in important ways. And it becomes the basis on which certainty is generated, even though our bodies and ourselves are actually very ambiguous phenomena. So datafication has permeated almost every sphere of activity, and particularly those activities that have significant economic import. As individuals, we're constantly generating data, and as you see on this slide, all kinds of actions and behaviors generate data, and a lot of it feeds into our health identities. We're walking, talking, breathing databases in and of ourselves, contributing to the mega databases that reside on servers around the world. And there is the larger bioeconomy that thrives on data from bodies, both directly and indirectly. Just yesterday, somebody was telling me about how TikTok videos now have become a huge repository of data. Just those 20-second videos can generate, both in the way they circulate and in the way we engage with them, a huge amount of data, and it's becoming an increasingly valuable property in the IT sector. So if you think about how, when you interlink databases that come from those sorts of behaviors with the databases that are generated through all the things that I've listed on this slide, it can lead to quite a mind-boggling array of information that can be recombined in multiple ways. So in the clinic, and I'm going to leave this slide up for a little while because it's really the space in which I'm working. There was this young artist that I gave my paper to, and I said, can you just generate one abstract visual that seems to represent my work? And this is what she did. So it's something that I'm adding to, but it represents the space in which I'm working. So in the clinic, it's conceivable that such a data layer, while offering valuable information, can potentially diminish attention to embodied presence and the subjective cues that the patient may communicate to and the doctor may discern. In medical education, the edification of data-based medicine can conceivably reduce the importance given to the development of sensitivity to and understanding of subjective experience. And here I'm talking about young doctors who are trained to think about data, to look at data, and look less at the embodied patient. In medical research, the collection of datafiable information may conceivably lead to the exclusion of those aspects of health and illness that are more resistant to abstraction as data. Reasons for positive deviance, for instance, or treatment outliers are often cultural and sociological in nature, aspects that cannot be easily captured for inclusion and processing in a database. My route to understanding these practices and their possible implications in fields of medical care and experience of illness is ethnographic and qualitative. Over the past year and a half, I've been speaking with a variety of stakeholders at different points in the data chain, as well as with care seekers, better known as patients, of course. And my attempt is to try and fill out this picture. So for instance, one doctor talks about 3 possible ways in which an encounter in the clinic might unfold. First time, the patient comes in and narrates a history, which may vary in detail depending on the level of reflection, memory, and articulation. Accompanying caregivers will add information that is one step removed from experience, but is still based on engaged observation. The clinic then undertakes some basic measurements, blood pressure, weight, age, and so on. The physician then adds more tests, and many of you may be quite familiar with this. And these tests will offer additional data points that allow the clinician to fill out the outline, look inside the body, probe its secrets, as Foucault says. And the hope is, the doctor feels, that this story will be much more dependable, even though it's less tangible than what the patient and the caregiver has told them. So experienced doctors are able to call on years of wisdom, but very often the newer trained doctors who are a product of this data gaze tend to depend overly on the data rather than on the embodied patient. So medical systems actually, what they do is sort us, and they try and deal with us through this process of sorting. So working in a somewhat different context, the scholar John Cheney-Lippold speaks of what he calls the measurable type, algorithmic caricatures that mediate and even form individual digital identity. Medical science, and particularly healthcare, has to a large extent relied on such measurable types to offer efficiency, and efficiency is often mistaken for efficacy. But the intensification of measurement and its penetration into more and more layers of the body allows an even greater level of abstraction, a distancing from experience, and a further separation of the physical and what might only vaguely describe as the psychological. At the most basic level, temperature records fever, and if one feels ill and does not record a number above the normal on the thermometer, one is read as normal. At a more complex level, the very construction of normal, and this is, I think, really important, depends unequivocally on a mass of data that's gathered from disparate ideal types, whose measurements have been plotted on a curve that defines deviance and its opposite. In fact, Cheney-Lippold's measurable type appropriates to some extent Max Weber's concept of the sociological ideal type. And medical science is based on first defining and then addressing deviations from the ideal. But to paraphrase Cheney-Lippold, when we, in relation to such an ideal type, are made of data, then we are not just represented, but also regulated by data. So this regulation of ourselves and of our identities is a result of multiple forces. And again, I'm speaking specifically in the context of healthcare. It arises out of a growing global bioeconomy that depends on the harvesting, processing, and packaging of many kinds of data about and around the body. Data that comes from individual bodies, but is subsumed within a large, often global database that is then repurposed for various ends, both commercial, as in the case of the pharmaceutical industry, and scientific. David Beer, whom I'm series of questions about how data is controlled and deployed, and ultimately how it regulates both perception and action. His concern is with the creation of data and its rendering into a form that allows it to speak for us. To quote him, I begin, notions of value are often woven into the uses and understandings of data, as well as the visions and promises that are attached to them. I close quote. Significantly, Beer acknowledges that the uses of data have uneven geographies and also variegated in their deployment. And this makes it important to look at how datafication in different spheres might play out across cultural, social, political, and economic contexts. So my own curiosities, against this whole context is, who or what is the patient? And I've listed the questions here. How is the patient rendered by data? What goes into the data shadows? And data shadows are those aspects of ourselves, our experience that cannot be datafied easily or as yet, rendered into data. How does the patient recover or integrate her selfhood, particularly in cases of chronic illness, as she emerges from this data-informed profile that the clinic constructs? What happens to the subjective narration of experience in a clinic that's governed by this data paradigm? what kind of new inequalities might emerge in the datafied clinic? And how might we imagine and articulate patient rights and clinical responsibility in such a space? So clearly, multiple stakeholders must be considered before we can get a sense of the dynamics that datafication introduces into the clinical space. But even at this early stage of my work, I've been able to discern some, movements and some sort of meanings, both for those seeking care and those providing it. For care seekers, there's an increasing sense of being distanced from the self. But at the same time, there is also the confidence that this very distance allows for the physician to call on an organized, complete knowledge base. In looking at the medical establishment, I find that there is a specific way in which data travels through the information chain. And this is a preliminary schematic that I've put together. And my interest is in trying to, understand this journey and what happens at what several scholars have called the points of friction, where data moves from one frame of reference or one interpretive frame into another. So this means that, as I talk to people, let's say, who handle tissue, they have a certain understanding of what that means. And then you talk to the pathologist who's looking through the microscope at the tissue and converting it into information that can be used by a clinician, something else happens. So it's actually very it's interesting to see how those who are engaged in these fields actually don't see the frictions. And perhaps that is the value of being a sociologist of science or health and trying to look at it from the outside and discern the politics and the meanings that emerge. So what I've listed here are the various points of possible friction and different cultures of practice in each of these points. The data frictions arise not only from the different kinds of practice that people, let's say a pathologist has and a physician has and, another kind of diagnostician has, but also in terms of categorization. So what one person calls a disease, another person may not. And, what are these data points that inform one thing or another? So these are the possible sort of contestations that one might look at or that might emerge when we try to understand the movement of data from one point to another. But then why do we want to study these things, and what's the point beyond our academic sort of curiosity? As somebody who's watched healthcare from very close quarters, I think the way doctors understand illness, the way patients experience illness, there's always a little bit of a parallax there. And the attempt is to reduce that parallax as much as we can. And when that parallax arises from something like datafication, my interest is in seeing, what can we do to help clinicians communicate and discern patient experience a little better, and how do we help patients so that they articulate their experience in a way that the medical establishment can actually respond to. So I think there are many areas where we can resist datafication or at least mitigate the data gaze, in terms of building databases, in terms of educating clinical practitioners, in terms of educating and sensitizing patients, and paying attention to what happens to data. It's not a fully formed thing, and I think to resist the idea that it is a fully formed thing. So these are some of the things that I think we as communication scholars, as media scholars, as social scientists can think about. How are databases constructed? How representative are they? In the context of Aadhaar, I know that I've reached the 20-minute mark, but I'll only take a couple of minutes. As we've seen with Aadhaar, people who have calloused fingers, for instance, or who have had eye injuries, biometrics don't seem to be, are a problem. So we might consider those data-resistant bodies. And there are other kinds of resistances that we have within ourselves that don't allow us to be so easily datafied. How does one equip oneself with a vocabulary of data so that you can be more empowered in the clinic. And what are the ethics of data collection, analysis, and use in the healthcare sector? So, this is my last slide, and I think it's important to kind of reposition what I'm doing in the media and communication studies space. And there are several scholars who are working in this area. There are now new labs that focus on things like data justice and data fairness. There's a lot of many people, including, we will have Nick Coldry and Ulysses Nayas speaking to us later in this series, who look at data valence and the dynamics of power that emerge in a datafied world. So these are some of the areas I think we as media and communication scholars can engage with. And although my interest is in health, I think these ideas can work anywhere in other fields as well. So thank you, and I hope I came across clearly enough. Yes. So Devina, over to you for the questions.
Thank you so much, Usha ma'am. There is so much data, sometimes we forget the human element. This presentation was a reminder to take notice of the subjective layers of experience that make up our embodied lives. We'll have live questions from the Zoom meeting participants shortly. I will ask you all the Zoom chat and FB live questions towards the end of the section, Usha. I request participants now to raise their hands. There is a feature available in Zoom next to your username. And I will announce your names in order. Kindly turn on your microphone and or video depending on your connection, internet connectivity, when it is your turn to ask your question. Please keep your questions as brief as possible so that we can have as many people having their questions responded to as possible by Usha ma'am.
Can I just ask one thing?
Sorry. Yes, please.
Yeah, should I just end the slide share? Should I stop?
Yes, I think yeah, that's a good idea. Yes, and we have the speakers, different people on the. All right. So yes, please raise your hands, and I can start having questions. Okay. So we have Rashil Anand Banpur. Please turn on your microphone and your video if you have the connection bandwidth.
Good afternoon. Am I audible?
Yes, please continue.
Great. Good afternoon to all participants and the presenter. Well, I'm Prashil, been part of the department, and have been in self-isolation for a couple of years now, not due to COVID though. Well, I have a couple of questions for Usha ma'am, more to do with the concept of approaching data. So, based on my observations, I'd like to articulate it this way. Well, when we look at census data, for instance, which may not directly be related to health data, it resulted in quite a few inequalities being addressed, and post which lives being bettered or empowered, if you could say that. And then, but what I came across in the paper is the term resisting datafication or resisting the data gaze, if I'm not wrong. I have a concern with the word resistance to data, because whether census data or the first HIV/AIDS pandemic data that was collected in the 80s actually helped flatten or rather equalize the inequalities. So I'm a bit concerned when we say resisting datafication or resisting the data gaze. to quickly add, sorry, I'm taking a bit of time, but just give me a few seconds. For instance, in Hyderabad, there is a place where a particular person follows Ayurvedic practices, health practices, and then does what is known as Nadi Yoga. So that person just touches the pulse of a patient and then engages about treatment to certain ailments that the patient might have. So how do we put this resistance to data into context is my question broadly. That's all.
Davina, should I answer, or do you want other questions as well?
No, I think it's a good idea to answer the question so that there's a linearity.
Yeah, so thanks, Prashil, for that question. And, obviously in the presentation, I, use the word resistance. And it's not so much resistance to data itself, because clearly, the fact of being counted is very important, and as in the census or as in epidemiological data and so on. So it's not so much a resistance to data itself, but it's a resistance to the totalizing influence of a data gaze. So while and also to look beneath the numbers, right? So as you yourself pointed out, I mean, the census, I think, one cannot argue that a census of any kind is really important, because it allows to count in people. But I think what we need to pay attention to is how this counting happens. In cases where we're using samples or, so-called representative populations, what are the logics on which that representation is based. So I think just to avoid the idea that once you have data, the story is told. But to look at how data is collected, what it does, and is there something beyond? And certainly, not to negate the use of medical data. I think it's, I wouldn't want to say that there's no use to the kind of data that's being collected. But my point is that we need to resist the totalizing influence of datafication. I mean, it's sort of a telegraphic answer, but yeah.
Thank you. Could we have Tirumal sir next, please? Please turn on your microphone and video if possible. We'd like to see you.
Hi.
Hello.
Thanks for this presentation, Usha. And the point that you're making to Prashil was, I thought, was the most important point that you're making across, if I got you right, which is a totalizing nature of the data. My question is, it's not exactly a question, but in terms of looking at the body, are you, do you have a very, let's say, a variety of approaches towards the body, whether it's a diseased body, a healthy body, or whatever body? Or is it, in some sense, is body a matter, or body is something which you can process data from? Is there something beyond the body which is talking about the body, in the sense that it is not clear to me whether body is representation or body is matter in itself?
I think it's both, because I think, one of the slippery sort of things in datafication is, I mean, of course, when you use medical diagnostics, right, you're looking at the body as matter. But you're looking at but in the process of turning the body or turning parts of the body into datafiable, into matter that can be datafied, right, there is also something that is lost. And it is in the reconstitution of that data into the body again. I mean, what's happening, right? So you take a blood sample and you read some numbers from it, and then the physician reads it. And when the physician reads it, he or she is actually reconstituting that data into the body. So I think in all of these steps, both things are happening. Yes, the body is seen as matter, but the body is also something more than matter. And when you talk about life, life is clearly something more than matter. So what is illness? What is health? What is it that we want from the clinic? Do we only want the clinic to treat our bodies as matter and not our bodies as representation? I think those are all questions that we need to ask. And one of the things I mentioned but that I didn't write was, one of the tensions, for instance, in a culture like India, where our notion of who we are is not so much about embodiment. I mean, when I say our, it's not everybody, but for many of us, when we say who we are, it's not so much about body. But the moment we enter the clinic, we are forced to be the body. And I think there are many of these questions then get lost when we approach the patient as a body of data, rather than think about the body as only providing data. The body is not data. The body is only providing data. So in the reconstitution of that data, there is one has to recognize that the body is more than that data. So, I think it's a complicated question, but I think it's something that we have to keep asking and trying to address.
Extend the question.
Yeah.
If one were to suggest that bodies have a potential to speak, and bodies are passive in one case, and bodies have potential to speak, and how would that kind of a shift in the way we think about body, human body or any other body, would actually mean for a datafication, in the sense that bodies can transform themselves, bodies can speak, bodies can say certain things about expressive. Bodies are expressive. If bodies are expressive and they're not just amenable for datafication, is there some other way of thinking about data itself in which you can capture this expression? What would be, in some sense, a very positive way of looking at data?
I'm not sure. I think I'll have to think about that. But in some senses, the reductionist way of, very often the way medical education reduces the reading of the body to the reading of data. That's something I have a problem with. So, clearly, enlightened physicians, people who think about this, do not do that. They do navigate between the body as an expressive, if you want to call it, object, and the stories that are told only through the data. But my concern is that increasingly medical systems, both in terms of education as well as in terms of record keeping. So, for instance, one of the doctors told me that the way the medical record is structured, there's very little space for narration. And there's a recent article by Siddhartha Mukherjee, which actually I quoted from but didn't have time to read, where he talks about the fact that electronic medical records are meant to be a resource, but they don't often contain these readings, these sort of vague, ambiguous readings that actually are useful for physicians when they're dealing with the kind of uncertainties that COVID-19, for instance, is presenting. So I think there's a case to be made for navigating between those two realities, the body as expressive and the body as something that can be rendered readable. So yeah, I think, your question requires more words than perhaps we have time for right now, but it's something I should think about more deeply. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Could we quickly have Anjali ma'am, please? Turn on your microphone and video if possible.
Dr. Raman. That was a lovely presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
I can hear you.
So my question is, I think, a very basic one. You indicated what doctors and physicians can do to mitigate the, effects of body being treated as just matter. What can patients do about this increasing data?
So actually, there's a lot of emerging literature from the quantified self movement. The quantified self movement is basically, those who use self trackers like Fitbits and so on to constantly monitor their activities and their health status, right? So, and this is just one example. It's not the full answer to your question. But while there has been a lot of criticism of the quantified self movement, what some scholars like Gina Neff, for instance, have found is that it's actually given people a vocabulary to talk about their bodies with more authority than they would have been able to otherwise. So the thing is to acquire, in any form of resistance, you need the vocabulary of the majority in order to resist that majority, right? So you need to acquire a vocabulary of presenting yourself as data in a way that you're able to actually resist the totalizing datafied gaze of the physician. So which is what I meant by patient education, right? So you go to Vijaya Diagnostics and you bring your sheaf of medical records from them, and you read your values, and very often there will also be a normal alongside it. And if your value deviates from that normal, you get worried. So if patients are actually sat down with and said, okay, this is what it means. It means, the normal, this is how the normal is constructed. Not that you do this at every instance, but if this becomes a way in which we understand the data about ourselves, and then we choose to speak with it or not speak with it. So I think one way of being empowered is to understand what data means, insofar to the extent that we can either choose to disregard it or take it seriously, or talk to the physician like we know what we're talking about. Yeah.
Okay,
And again,
thank you. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to say that, one of the sort of discomforts of this kind of forum is that you're forced to give answers in capsules. And so none of my answers are going to be complete. So I have to apologize in advance for that. Yes.
Right, thank you. Could we have Sumana ma'am next? Please turn on your microphone and video. Dr. Sumana Kasturi, can you hear us? All right, I think she's fallen off the meeting. I think we have one of our students online, Bhargav. Are you there? Could you please unmute yourself?
Okay.
Bhargav?
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes,
Okay.
please.
Thanks for the presentation, Usha ma'am. I have a question in terms of methodology. I was wondering, ideally for any ethnographer, what she or he has need to have in mind is the ethnic or the community, or typically in 19th century and 20th century they had a tribe to go. What actually is that sort of community here? I'm asking specifically because when such sort of health related studies are being done in, say, sociology or regional studies or anthropology department, they have specifically in mind a community of either patients or doctors or both. What actually, since you mentioned ethnography, I'm interested particularly in this question to know how you are addressing that or how you are looking at that aspect. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, actually, maybe I should say ethnographic rather than ethnography, right? So, so what I've been trying to do is like gain access to labs, gain access to places like Apollo and LV Prasad, which I'm very familiar with, and try and observe what happens through the data collection chain and talk to different people along that chain. So I wouldn't call it an ethnography in the traditional sense of being embedded within the community to observe, but engaging with the community repeatedly, and by the community I mean broadly the healthcare community and the community of healthcare seekers. So far my work has mostly been in the space of the healthcare system. I've not spoken much to patients yet. I've only had a few interviews with patients. So when I go to, let's say the blood bank, not the hematology section in Apollo, I sit there and I watch while the pathologist, somebody brings her the tissues, she has conversations with them, she works at her microscope. So I'm there for long enough to understand the culture of that space, and long enough for them to actually start to observe their conversations and for them to feel comfortable talking to me. So to that extent, it's ethnographic. It's more like, I don't know if you've read people who've done sociology of science lab ethnographies like Chetina Noor and so on. So that's the sort of approach that they would take. They embed themselves long enough in these laboratory situations to overcome any sense of newness from those who occupy that space normally, and then you both observe and you ask questions.
Yes, so we've had Grima online raising her hand for a little while now. Could you please unmute your microphone and ask your question, and if possible, video as well?
Thank you, ma'am, for the wonderful talk. Ma'am, can you elaborate a bit on the difference between medical gaze as developed by Foucault and the data gaze in medical system? Thank you, ma'am.
Okay. Yeah. So when Foucault talks about the medical gaze, he's mostly, he is talking about the theater of the clinic, right? And about the fact that in the clinic there is the theatrical space, the theatrical sort of construction of the clinic in terms of the way the lighting exists, the positioning of the physician and the patient and so on, allows the physician to occupy a space of power that then allows him or her, mostly in those cases it was him, to look at the patient as, to objectify the patient in certain ways, and render the patient as a body that can be governed. So the medical gaze is, both the data gaze and the medical gaze, are within the discourse of biopolitics. I would say the data gaze is perhaps a subset of the medical gaze. It's a more particular form of the medical gaze. But otherwise it does draw from Foucault's medical gaze. The medical gaze is, I think, more expansive than the data gaze, which is a little more particular and informed mostly, almost entirely by the data flows that come into the clinic.
Okay, Vinod sir has a very pertinent question regarding the times we're in. So if you could have him next, please. Could you turn on your microphone and video, sir?
Yeah, you can hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah. Usha, thanks for that presentation. I'm not sure regulation is of concern to you in the context of this paper, but I just have this broad question about where are we in terms of data protection, regulation in the field of health? How do we, for example, relate to the issue of right to science in international law with data protection in health? Because I know that groups like the Global Alliance for Genomics has a framework for responsible sharing of genomics data, right? And people like Usha Raman and others have been talking about these things in the context of Arogya Setu and some other centralized data collection devices. So I'm just wondering, your views on where we are at the regulatory framework.
Yeah, you're right in that, my focus has not so much been on regulation. But I mean, one of the sort of insights that I've gained from reading the literature around data and power is that very often the routes to the ways in which these conventions are enforced, whether it is the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health Data or whatever, is through ethics committees, right? So the ICMR, for instance, will translate these regulatory frameworks into specific guidelines that ethics committees need to follow. And ethics committees then need to look at every research protocol in terms of whether they're complying with the norms in terms of fairness and openness and equity in terms of data sharing. So I think right now at that level, and that's the level at which I, am able to see some of this happening. I don't think people are asking those questions, in terms of, so there is always, antennae always go up when it comes to sharing tissues or sharing stem cells, for instance, or something like that. But the antennae are not going up as often and as rapidly when it comes to data. And so I think there still needs to be there's still a gap between, what the activists are saying and the translation of those recommendations into regulations and the implementation of those regulations as guidelines for ethics committees. So I think there's still a big gap there. And people don't seem to yet ask questions about completeness of data. So for instance, somebody will be doing a normative database. They want to build a normative database. And people are not asking questions like, so who's in this database? Are you looking at tribal populations? Are you looking at enough women in tribal populations? So I think those sorts of nuanced questions are still not being asked in ethics committees. Yeah.
Thanks, Usha.
Thank you. Could we have Manisha next? Manisha, can you hear me? Please unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Thank you for the talk, ma'am. I just had a question regarding what exactly is the value of such data, which what I mean is, when we talk about data of the human body, it's constantly changing, right? Like our blood pressure or insulin or testosterone levels, they're always fluctuating. And when we look at medical data, it would at best say draw a figure from a point in time and place. And so in such a scenario, what is the value of such data for practice or otherwise? Because even when we look at when we look at records, they're always post facto, like that has happened at a point in time which was in the past. And what would that value be? What would its value be for us in practice and otherwise? Thank you.
So the thing is that so what you're asking is, what's the value of a data point at any given point in time, right? So the value of extracting data at a given point in time is to see how it compares with the what is called the norm, so that's the value of it. The value is to see the deviation from the norm. And I think there is an understanding that what you're capturing is, a snapshot at a particular point in time, which is why medical science is always inexact and always arbitrary to some extent. But the idea is that, if you the one kind of data that I know a little bit about is glycosylated hemoglobin, right? Or blood sugar. So the idea that if you measure blood sugar at a particular point in time and it varies wildly from what is normal, what is thought to be normal, it may not be good enough. So you have to measure it at multiple points in time and draw a picture. So I think the medical establishment has a way of reading data across time to make sense of it. So there is value even in snapshots at a particular time. So I wouldn't negate that. I guess my larger point is not so much that there is data and that we read people as data, but that we should read people as more than data. And that people should have, I mean, there's another debate about ownership and so on, which I'm not getting into, that people should have the means, the ability, the knowledge to read their own data to some extent.
Thank you, ma'am. So we now have a few very interesting questions that have come in on Zoom chat and Facebook chat. And I'd like to ask you them one by one. And I'll try to club them wherever possible as well so that we save some time. But before I ask, I would like the speaker especially and other participants to give me permission to extend the talk by a little bit. Because some of the questions are very interesting and I'd like to hear the answers by Usha. So maybe by an extension of say 10 minutes, I'll try to wrap up in yeah. So Arun, an alumna of University of Hyderabad, asks, how does one verify data, taking into question subjectivity or fakeness? A similar line of inquiry is coming in from Shashi, who's a current PhD student at the Department of Communication. He says, as one goes through the data deluge in these times of COVID-19, cases and related information, my sense is that after a point, one becomes numb or loses empathy. And probably the same thing happens with a doctor, depending on how much data is needed to treat a patient. Doesn't it dehumanize the patient to an extent? And I understand that data is extremely important to make medical decisions, but maybe this is too much of data skepticism, but this question bothers me, is what Shashi is saying. Maybe if you could take these two together.
Okay, so yeah, so in terms of Shashi's question, one way to answer that would be to tell you what one of my interviewees said. He's an oncologist, and you know, oncologists more than many specialties, you know, are very familiar with suffering, right? Extended suffering. And they also are constantly looking at data. I mean, between chemos, what's the remission rate, all kinds of data. So what he said is that, yes, he looks at, he's looking at the patient's data. He's also looking at the evidence base to look at, you know, what's the history of a particular chemo treatment for a particular patient and so on. But because, but he said the only way to kind of keep your focus on the patient, to keep your empathy, is to constantly to read all the data, set it aside, and then to listen to the patient, and to try and remember that the evidence base is often generated in a largely Western context. Most of, 90% of the papers are generated on Western subjects, based on Western subjects, and to cross that distance between data and patient experience by listening to the patient and paying attention to them. And I think, experienced doctors actually have a way of keeping their empathy intact. I mean, I don't know that I'm answering your question here, but so there's a delicate dance between, so you're talking about dehumanizing a patient with data. And I think, in fact, a good doctor uses data in a way that doesn't dehumanize, uses the data sort of as a backdrop, but foregrounds the patient experience. But this is happening with older doctors, not so much with the younger ones, who I think their coping mechanism is to dehumanize and depend on data. So So data is important, but data is not all important. And I guess I've been saying that over and over again. And I think, despite all my skepticism about medical practice and about data, what I find hopeful is that experienced doctors actually don't overemphasize data. But the problem is that then do you have to wait for 20 years of experience before you know that data isn't everything? And that's the space that I feel like we need to focus on.
I'd like to raise two questions from Facebook Live comments. One is by Tawheed Rahman and the other is by Viola Rose Fernandez. And it's sort of connecting to what you've just spoken about. And these questions are similar, which is why I'm clubbing them together. So Tawheed asks, since there's very little medical data.
I'm losing you, Devina. I couldn't hear you. I can't hear you.
Can you see the question?
No, yeah, now I can see it, yes.
Yeah.
Since there's very little medical data in India, doctors are left with no choice but to take a call based on Western data. How safe is that practice and what would a patient do? So my answer to that is sort of related to the previous one, in that doctors as part of medical education, I think they need to be also skeptical about data and know that data is generated often in populations that are unlike the ones that they are treating. So when I'm talking about the whole idea of not submitting to a totalizing data gaze, it is to retain this sort of skepticism. So as part of medical education, I think doctors there's an emphasis on the evidence base, but there's not sufficient emphasis on where this evidence base comes from and how it is built. So yes, doctors in India or in other countries where normative databases have not been generated sufficiently, they do have to depend on Western data. But I think this is a case for demanding that even that Western data is more transparent. So even in the West, if you look at the Western populations are not homogeneous either, right? So to ask, how is this database built? Where did the data points come from? And then use your judgment to what extent you need to depend on the database or extrapolate from it, or depend on more proximal information that you have access to.
There is a question by Viola Rose.
Viola Rose, yeah. Private healthcare is a data trap for both seekers and caregiver.
Yeah, I clubbed this with the question by Tawheed.
Yeah. So I think one thing that diagnostic labs, for instance, need to do is to have more information on what their numbers mean. So just like you have, nowadays you walk into a clinic or any diagnostic center and you'll have all these things about, what you should do if you're a diabetic or what you should do if. But I think you also need information on what numbers mean. Health education often doesn't go into that space because it's thought of as too technical. But I think, it will go a long way in allaying people's fears if they know, and I'm not just talking about numbers, but even about reading, an MRI or reading. And the problem is in India, very often, the patient is the first person who gets that MRI. It doesn't go to a doctor and then come to the patient, right? So very often the patient has this space where anxieties then spike, even before meaning can be assigned or understood properly. So so I think, I like the way you've used data trap, and I think we can unpack that in multiple ways in terms of, what's the commercial implication of it, what are hospitals doing with that data to make money out of it, and so on and so forth. There's all of that as well. But in terms of patients, I think, to kind of demystify what numbers mean, demystify data, to understand themselves against the normal, and know that deviations are not all bad. Some deviations are still within a range that are safe. So
we have a question from an alumna, Dr. Subbarao, who's right now with ICMR, and he's interested in asking if qualitative data, which has certain element of subjectivity and datafication, whether we can use that to overcome this conundrum. So does qualitative data also involve a sort of data gaze?
Well, I think, it's a really interesting question. And, I think it makes us ask ourselves whether it is even possible to write about anything without datafying in some way. And can we, so whether it is qualitative or quantitative, in a way you are fixing the subject in a way that allows them to be rendered intelligible, right? And if that rendering intelligible has to fit certain norms, then you're in a way doing exactly what data does. So I think it's a really interesting question, and I think I have to think more deeply about it, really, to give you a good answer.
So to go off on a tangent here, we have another alumna, Preeti Raghunath, and her question on Facebook is that a lot of data is personal and comes under the ambit of the data protection bill, whereas privacy in that context is a huge concern. Arogya Setu app has been, we've had that come out in the news recently. So she would like your thoughts on non-personal data. Is that a way to avoid the totalizing effect of the data gaze?
What's non-personal data?
So non-personal data is aggregated data, where you take all of the data together, and so big data.
Yeah. So see, I think there are dangers in. So I think, in order to, let's say in healthcare specifically, one wants personal data, and you use non-personal data in order to make sense, to provide a sort of backdrop against which you can understand the small data. So I think, yes, we need aggregated data to make policy decisions, to to understand large movements, etc. But we also need proximal personal data, and of course, concerns of privacy are important. But to not pay attention, I think we need to pay attention to how the personal fits against the aggregate, and I'm speaking specifically in the case of medical data. So I don't think one can disregard personal data. Of course, you don't need it in many instances, as in the Arogya Setu app. Of course, there's the argument is that why do you need certain kinds of data that the app may collect, which is not inimical, or which is not necessary for the kind of decisions that need to be made about quarantining or cordoning off or treatment, etc. But in the case of a clinical scenario, I think you need both.
Right. I'm afraid this is all the time we have today for questions. In case your question was not answered, please email it to the administrator at praney@uohyd.ac.in. We'll send them to Usha ma'am, and then we post them along with her response on the Facebook page as comments. So you can watch that space. This recording will be available on the department's Facebook page as well as on YouTube. Thank you so much, Usha ma'am, for taking time out for us today. I must remind all of you that the International Association for Media and Communication Research, INCR, is holding elections from today, 11th to 31st May, and they will have sent you an email this morning. And Usha ma'am is running, so please vote for her.
This was not supposed to be a campaign.
I know. It's just something that I did. Sorry.
Okay.
Next Monday, we have Dr. Preeti Raghunath, who will discuss community radio policies in South Asia, a deliberative policy ecology approach. Thank you so much for joining us today, everybody. See you next Monday. Bye-bye. Have a good day.